Chapter 9, Energy. The learning outcomes for this chapter include: recognize the events associated with the evolution of U.S. energy policy, especially since the 1973 OPEC oil embargo. Comprehend the complex relationships between the United States and global energy consumption and production patterns, while recognizing the implications for energy consumption and production in the future. Investigate the development, history, advantages, and problems with different standard energy sources, coal, petroleum, natural gas, nuclear energy, and associated regulations or statutes. In spite of the huge dependence the United States has developed for energy resources, we lack a cohesive and consistent approach to energy policy. Each administration adopts its own specific approach, which might later be interrupted by the next administration. In October of 1973, America saw the first use of the phrase energy crisis. At that time, we were importing 38.8% of the daily petroleum consumption. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries voted to cut its oil production by 5% monthly until Israel made fundamental changes in its Arab policies. The day after that vote, Saudi Arabia, OPEC's major producer, cut its oil exports by 10% and ended all petroleum shipments to the United States until the Nixon administration altered its pro-Israeli policies. The loss of 2 million barrels of oil a day shocked Americans into suddenly recognizing how dependent we had become on foreign oil. The loss also forced Americans to recognize that political, economic, and military risks this dependence entailed. From an environmental standpoint, the situation was a crisis because if the oil shortage continued for long, the United States might be compelled to increase greatly its mining of coal, with potentially disastrous ecological consequences. In response to the OPEC oil embargo, Nixon took the first steps in United States history toward comprehensive national energy planning. He established the Federal Energy Office, FEO, within the White House staff in 1973. The next year, he established the Federal Energy Administration, which was given the authority to initiate federal policy and take whatever steps the White House deemed necessary for national energy needs. Congress likewise contributed to developing a national energy policy by creating the Energy Research and Development Administration, ERDA, to consolidate all federal energy research in a single agency. Until his forced resignation in 1974, Nixon continued to urge legislation designed to increase the federal role in energy management. He proposed laws restricting public and private energy consumption, providing unemployment insurance for those who lost jobs due to the energy crisis, temporarily relaxing air pollution standards for automobile emissions and power plants, and imposing a windfall profits tax to keep companies from making excess profits by rapidly increasing energy prices. He used powers granted to him by Congress to impose mandatory allocations of selected fossil fuels, as well as to set up an allocation program and price guidelines for crude oil and petroleum. By the end of Nixon's term, his administration and Congress had also instituted national daylight savings time and a 55-mile-per-hour speed limit as conservation efforts. They had funded new federal programs for research into solar energy and had encouraged private development of nuclear energy. The energy crisis continued through the Ford administration, with Ford submitting a package of measures in his 1975 Energy Policy Conservation Act, focusing on programs designed to give flexibility to the administration in handling energy problems. This act established the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, SPR, which seeks to minimize the impact of an oil importing crisis like the one in 1973. President Carter came into office making energy policy his number one priority. A month after taking office, he set forth his National Energy Plan, NEP, organized around four broad objectives. 1. Centralize federal energy planning through institutional reform. 2. To achieve greater energy efficiency through selective use of market forces and a major expansion of federal regulatory policy. 3. To increase rapidly federal spending on research and development of new technology for energy conservation and productivity. And 4th, to ensure environmental protection and social equity would be important in these new programs. Over 200 separate proposals were considered by Congress in relationship to the NEP. Many were defeated, and the program was perceived by many as hastily constructed and too complex. But by the end of his term, Carter had made some significant changes in federal energy policy. The Department of Energy, DOE, had been created, domestic gas and petroleum prices had been decontrolled, increased government funding had been provided for federal research and development for new energy technologies, and more environmental safeguards on energy had been established. Reagan's victory signaled the end of the energy crisis, at least as perceived by the executive and the general public. In his first National Energy Plan, Reagan informed the public that the forecast for energy supplies was not as bad as some had thought. There were going to be no more wars on energy. Reagan's program of regulatory relief was going to be applied to energy policies as well as to other regulatory actions. Within a few years, energy policy had been dramatically altered. There was a return to the pre-embargo days of abundant energy. This new philosophy continued through the first Bush administration. Reagan tried to abolish the Department of Energy, but Congress would not go along with him, and he had to be content with reducing the Energy's authority. He slashed the budget of the Office of Strip Mining, weakening its ability to enforce regulations. His Secretary of State attempted to lease more public land on the outer continental shelf and in federal wild areas for energy exploration than had been leased in the entire period prior to the Nixon election. Funding for energy conservation programs and research for renewable energy sources, such as solar and wind power, was slashed. In the mid-1985, energy no longer appeared in the public opinion polls as the major concern. Conservation of energy was no longer a concern by the late 1980s. In 1989, Ford Motor Company brought back the V8 engine in its Mustang, an act representative of the return to the gas-guzzling muscle car. By 1990, Americans were no longer interested in energy-efficient houses. Many developers had quit building them because of the lack of demand. In 1986, residential energy demand had exceeded industrial demand for the first time. By the end of Reagan's term, funding for research and development of renewable energy sources had fallen to 18% of 1980 levels, and federal tax credits for the use of these alternative energy sources had expired. There were some indications that the 1990s might see a renewed interest in national energy policy. The 1990 invasion of Kuwait, which made Americans again aware of the danger of dependence on foreign oil, may have served as a partial stimulus. In February 1991, then President George H.W. Bush introduced a National Energy Strategy, NES, in an attempt to achieve roughly equal measures of new energy production and conservation. The NES focused on 5 major categories: energy security, energy and economic efficiency, future energy supplies, environmental quality, and expanding scientific research and education. A follow-up report on the NES indicated that considerable progress had been made in the implementation of NES initiatives. As part of the implementation of NES, the first President Bush issued an executive order on federal energy management in April of 1991. If fully implemented, the order was projected to save taxpayers up to $800 million in annual energy costs and cut federal energy consumption by the equivalent of 1,000 barrels of oil per day. The success of this executive order was borne out in 2000 when the Department of Energy announced that reduction in energy use had been achieved, and a year early. Reducing energy use to 20% below 1985 levels by 1999 has saved taxpayers over $19 billion since 1985, and $2 billion of that in 1999 alone, and has reduced greenhouse gases by 2.4 million metric tons since 1985. The issuing of these initiatives by then President Bush culminated in the signing of the Energy Policy Act of 1992. The Energy Policy Act, EPA Act, addresses energy issues such as alternative fuels, electric vehicles, renewable energy, coal, global climate change, reduction of oil vulnerability, energy and the environment, and energy and economics. The EPA Act is somewhat revolutionary in that it marks a serious attempt to structure U.S. energy policy. The Act established several different programs and requirements for federal, state, and municipal governments and the private sector. The EPA Act was very ambitious. It required uniform labeling of alternative fuels and alternative fuel vehicles, established low-interest loans for private sector small business for the purposes of converting to alternative fuels. It required that vehicles acquired by federal and state governments in 1999 and 2000 respectively must be at least 75% alternative fuel vehicles. Promoted increased reliance on renewable energy. Established a director of climate protection in the Department of Energy, as well as a global climate change response fund to be used in global efforts on climate change. Created programs to study methods of increasing energy efficiency. Established the Spark M. Matsunanga Renewable Energy and Ocean Technology Center to research renewable energy and energy storage. Promoted advanced mathematics and science education for underprivileged and first-generation college students. The EPA Act is comprehensive and complex law that attempts to provide a coherent energy policy for the United States. One of the interesting provisions in the EPA Act is a clause allowing for mortgage incentives on energy-efficient homes. President Clinton issued executive orders that had the following major goals: reducing greenhouse gas emissions from federal agency energy use to 30% below 1990 levels by 2010. Reducing energy consumption of federal agencies to 30% below 1985 levels by 2005 and 35% below by 2010. Installing 20,000 solar systems in federal facilities by 2010. The Clinton administration energy policy mainly centered on the reduction of energy use explicitly through voluntary programs. Examples of these programs include Energy Star, including the former Green Lights program, and the Landfill Methane Outreach program. Both programs fall under the direction of the Environmental Protection Agency's Atmospheric Pollution Prevention Division. The mission statement of this division is to improve building energy and office equipment efficiency. Energy Star, through its promotion of energy-efficient household products and home building techniques in 2008, prevented greenhouse gas emissions equivalent to removing 29 million cars from the road. In addition, over $19 billion were saved in energy costs as a result of voluntary compliance with the Energy Star's guidelines. Concerning the use of alternative fuels, the EPA's Green Power Partnership is a voluntary program encouraging the use of green power in homes and offices. As part of the Energy Policy Act of 1992, tax credits can be awarded for use of green power. During the Clinton administration, automobile manufacturers were encouraged to develop alternative fuel vehicles through the voluntary partnership for a new generation of vehicles. A collaboration between the manufacturer and the government agencies such as the Department of Energy, EPA, Department of Transportation, and the Office of Science Technology Policy. During the George W. Bush administration, the recurrent theme was to favor finding ways to increase U.S. fossil fuel production rather than to encourage conservation or to incentivize it with policy. This included opening of public lands for oil and natural gas exploration, allowing environmentally harmful coal mining strategies, for example, mountaintop removal, tax incentives to oil, gas, coal, and nuclear, less assistance to alternative energy. 2002 budget cut alternative energy allocation in half, cuts to efficiency programs throughout time in office. Meanwhile, investing in hydrogen, 1,300 and 1,900 power plants to be built from 2001 to 2021. Vice President Dick Cheney, former CEO of Halliburton, a company focused on fossil fuel-derived energy services, famously stated, "Conservation may be a sign of personal virtue, but it's not a sufficient basis for a sound, comprehensive energy policy." This stance was reflected in the composition of the Bush administration Energy Transition Team, which was the precursor to the Energy Task Force hosted by Cheney. The team included 63 members chaired by Cheney, 50 members representing energy supply industries, 1 member with energy efficiency expertise, 0 renewable energy experts, 27 members from the oil and gas industry, 17 members from the nuclear power or uranium mining industries, 16 members from the electricity industry, 7 members from the coal industry, 1 member representing public interest. An important advance under President Obama was the movement in the CAFE standards for the U.S. beginning with 2012 models. He mandated a fleet average of 35.5 miles per gallon by 2016, with the ultimate goal of 54.5 miles per gallon for the fleet by 2025. During the first year in office, Obama had initially talked about America's becoming the 21st century's clean energy leader by harnessing the power of alternative and renewable energy, ending our addiction to foreign oil, addressing the global climate crisis, and creating millions of new green jobs. On March 30th, 2011, the White House released its Blueprint for a Secure Energy Future, which has 3 main objectives. 1. Develop and secure America's energy supplies. 2. Provide consumers with choices to reduce cost and save energy. And 3. Innovate our way to a clean energy future. The first aim would be met by expanding safe and responsible domestic oil and gas development and production, and by leading the world towards safer and more energy secure supplies. The second would be met by reducing consumers' costs at the pump with more efficient cars and trucks and cutting energy bills with more efficient homes and buildings. The third would be met by harnessing America's clean energy potential so that 80% of the electricity will come from new energy sources by 2035, winning the future through clean energy research and development, and leading by examples so that the federal government models best practices and clean energy technologies. One of the reasons that a lack of a coherent long-term energy policy is problematic is that as a nation, the United States has extremely high energy demands, consuming about 1/4 of the world's energy production. Although the U.S. population more than doubled from 1949 to 2010, our energy consumption grew 206% during the same period, which is a 48% increase per capita energy use. Consumption of energy is consistent with our high standard of living, large land mass, low population density, and historically abundant, relatively low-cost energy resources. The great demand for energy can be better understood if we examine the 4 economic activities that place the greatest energy demands on our energy resources: residential, commercial, industrial, and transportation. Figure 9.2 depicts demand for energy in the United States. Because of the large number of single-family dwellings, the relatively spaciousness of those dwellings, relatively small average family size, a desire for heating and cooling systems to maintain uniform indoor temperatures year-round, and a wide range of labor-saving devices, the U.S. energy use per dwelling is among the highest in the world. Residential energy use currently accounts for 22% of the total primary energy demand. More than 60% of that is for heat and hot water. Approximately 30% is used to run major appliances. Commercial energy use is primarily for lighting, heating, cooling commercial buildings. Approximately 1/3 of the nation's energy demands come from industry. 88% of that demand can be traced to the 6 most energy-intensive industries, including steel, paper, and chemical. Finally, transportation of goods and people accounts for 1/4 of the energy consumption. Most of this energy comes from petroleum used to power automobiles, planes, trains, ships, and trucks. From 1949 to 1973, the demand for energy in the United States more than doubled. However, from 1973 to 1991, consumption increased only 10%. Still, the 2001 National Energy Policy, developed by the George W. Bush administration, called for construction of 1,300 to 1,900 new power plants over the next 20 years, or 60 to 90 new power plants per year to keep up with the projected energy demand of the United States. Production of energy occurs through many different energy sources, including fossil fuels, water, and renewable forms of energy. Although fossil fuels are the most common energy source for the United States, interest in renewable forms of energy seems to be on the rise. Coal is the nation's most plentiful fossil fuel, constituting approximately 90% of U.S. hydrocarbon reserves. At one time, providing over 90% of our energy needs, today coal supplies about 25%. At present rates of consumption and production, there are sufficient global reserves to last approximately 164 years. Most of the coal reserves are located in 3 regions of the country: the 7-state Appalachian region, the Midwestern Plains, and the Western Plains and Grasslands. Roughly half of the coal reserves are in the West, and approximately 60% of those are on public lands. Most of the coal on these Western reserves is low in sulfur content, Most of the coal in the eastern reserves is privately owned and has high sulfur content. Because of the tightened sulfur dioxide emission standards that took effect in 2000 as part of Phase 2 of the Clean Air Act amendments, the majority of the coal production now occurs in the West. Because coal is so plentiful and its use would therefore reduce U.S. dependence on foreign oil, and because an increase in coal production could increase employment, every president since Nixon has, in some way, sought to increase our reliance on coal. Congress has also been supportive of a greater use of coal. The Obama administration, much to the disappointment of many environmentalists, continued this governmental support for coal, saying that we cannot get all our energy from renewable resources in the next 20 years. Obama created the Task Force on Carbon Capture and Storage, with the hope of getting 5 to 10 demonstration clean coal commercial projects by 2016. The Energy Department also invested $1 billion to revive FutureGen, a program that has as its goal developing the technology that captures carbon dioxide from coal-fired power plants and building the first zero-emissions coal plant in the United States. The project had initially been funded several years ago, but funding was pulled by President Bush because of cost overruns. Many environmentalists are skeptical of the idea that technology can ever make coal clean and are frustrated by spending money trying to develop this technology rather than devoting it into research related to renewable energy. Given the plentiful nature of coal and its positive impact on employment, one may wonder why the United States does not more wholeheartedly endorse a policy that emphasizes the use of coal. The burning of coal produces 5 principal emissions that are harmful to the environment and human health: carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, particulates, and mercury. One of the major factors in acid rain is sulfur dioxide emissions. Increased use of coal, especially high sulfur coal, may increase acid deposition. Coal produces more carbon dioxide per unit of energy than petroleum or natural gas, and is the second largest energy production contributor of carbon dioxide to the United States at 36.5%. Figure 9.3 shows the relative carbon dioxide emissions of the 3 largest fossil fuels in the United States. Such pollutants significantly contribute to the deterioration of public health, especially in the development of respiratory ailments such as asthma. Another major problem associated with the use of coal is that coal mining can have disastrous environmental effects, especially strip or surface mining. Roughly 44% of the western coal and 18% of the eastern coal reserves are accessible by strip mining. There are 3 basic types of surface mining: contour mining, area mining, and open pit mining. Contour mining, also commonly referred to as mountaintop removal, is the main type of mining used in Appalachia. The miner excavates a portion of the hillside where the coal seam intersects the surface. Then the soil that covers the seam is stripped off, following the seam along the contour as far into the mountain as possible. The excess dirt unearthed to reveal the coal is thrown downhill from where the coal is removed. In flat or rolling terrain, area mining is used. The earth is stripped off the coal and piled up to one side in a ridge along the area from which the coal has been removed. Open pit mining is similar to area mining, except that the area from which the coal has been stripped is much deeper than the thickness of the land that was stripped off. So the stripped off land, called the overburden, is not thick enough to replace the coal that was removed. Consequently, a deep depression is left. If unregulated, the results of strip mining are acres of barren, sterile land. Unregulated strip mining may cause soil erosion, pollution of streams from mining runoff, destruction of the land for agricultural purposes, destruction of ecosystems, and loss of habitat for numerous species. As a result, millions of acres in more than 30 states have been disturbed by strip mining, and most of these acres remain abandoned wasteland, no longer claimed by those who took the coal and no longer productive. Additionally, thousands of miles of streams have been buried or destroyed, and the practice continues today. In 2003, the EPA released an environmental impact statement on mountaintop removal coal mining, detailing many of the harmful environmental effects to the surrounding ecosystems. Yet despite the EIS, the Bush administration continued to encourage strip mining practices by allowing mining waste to cover over streams and creeks in violation of the Clean Water Act. New rules and regulations finalized in 2004 by EPA made it easier for companies to receive permits allowing for greater valley fill. The Obama administration has revoked some permits and enacted more stringent regulations, such as prohibiting the dumping of mining waste into waterways and requiring a 100-foot buffer between debris and waterways, but has largely allowed the practice to continue, angering environmentalists. Despite these disastrous environmental consequences, surface mining continues because it's much cheaper, less labor-intensive, and more efficient, more profitable, and safer than underground mining. Strip mining practices, however, are increasingly being challenged in court. Using the Clean Water Act, citizen and environmental groups are working to stop more environmentally harmful practices of strip mining. In 2002, a federal judge overturned a Bush administration rule that allowed strip mining refuse to be dumped over the waterways. Unfortunately, in 2003, the Fourth Circuit Court in Virginia overruled the decision and reinstated the rule. Similarly, in 2009, another federal judge granted an injunction in West Virginia blocking the use of nationwide permits because they failed to examine the full impact of mountaintop removal. In an attempt to contain some of the disastrous consequences of strip mining, Congress passed the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act of 1977, SMCRA. Vetoed twice by President Ford and strongly opposed by the mining industry, the act was finally signed into law by President Carter. The primary objective of the act, as indicated by its name, was to force the mining industry to return the land from which it stripped coal to a level of productivity equal to or superior to its condition prior to mining. The Act contains very strong provisions that are extremely pleasing to environmentalists, but the implementation of the Act from the environmentalist perspective has been a disaster. Under the Act, a number of environmental protection performance standards were established regulating a broad range of activities, including the removal, storage, and redistribution of topsoil, silting and erosion control, and drainage and protection of water. A new executive agency, the Office of Surface Mining Reclamation and Enforcement, OSM, was created within the Department of Interior to enforce the Act. To ensure that this agency was not captured by mining industry, the OSM could, by statute, employ only individuals from other agencies who had no association with any authority, program, or function intended to promote the use of the development of coal. The primary means for enforcement of SMCRA is through a permit system that can be administered by the states if they adopt programs for enforcing the Act that are at least as stringent as the federal program. Despite the fact that SMCRA reads like a strong piece of environmental regulations, its effectiveness is highly questionable. The Act has been fraught with problems from the beginning. Under the Carter administration, many strong regulations were drafted, a number of which were vehemently opposed by the mining industry. One of the industry's most common arguments was that the OSM exceeded its authority to establish performance standards for mine sites when it set standards for both the types of controls to be used and the standard of performance to be met. It also argued that standards were too rigid and did not allow for enough local flexibility. Industry's complaints were heated shortly after the Reagan administration came to power. Under the auspices of the Interior Department, Secretary James Watt, approximately 90% of the regulations promulgated under the Carter administration were rewritten. The OSM also underwent massive downsizing, making serious enforcement of the law almost impossible. Under the Obama administration, however, there was some progress. In June 2009, officials of the Environmental Protection Agency, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and the Department of the Interior signed a memorandum of understanding outlining a series of administrative actions to reduce harmful environmental impacts of mountaintop mining and surface coal mining in Appalachia. The plan includes a series of near-term and longer-term actions that emphasize specific steps, improved coordination, and greater transparency of decisions. The actions are being implemented through the regulatory proposals, guidance documents, and review of applications for permits to authorize surface coal mining in Appalachia. The increased scrutiny of permits and more stringent regulations angered many of the coal mining industry, especially since a consequence was the rejection or revocation of a number of permits. The mining industry challenged many of the actions taken under the Memorandum of Understanding and were successful in having some struck down. Operating under this memorandum in 2010, the EPA issued a guidance relative to water quality of streams affected by fills resulting from mountaintop removal, and application of the guidance led to several previously issued permits being put on hold or revoked. Since 1955, petroleum and natural gas have been the primary sources of energy for the United States, supplying over 2/3 of our energy needs. Natural gas is a fossil fuel that, like petroleum, burns cleanly and efficiently, producing few pollutants. It constitutes about 30% of domestic energy production. Approximately 1/4 of this domestic production satisfies about 40% of the residential energy needs. To combat national security concerns, President Bush ordered the strategic petroleum reserves filled to their capacity. Even when filled to capacity, however, the strategic petroleum reserve is only enough oil to supply the United States for 5 weeks at current consumption levels. The SPR constitutes the largest emergency oil reserves in the world. Natural reserves of natural gas in the United States are not extensive. The proven reserves in the United States constitute 3% of the world's supply of natural gas, ranking the United States at 6th in the world for proven reserves. Petroleum and natural gas share common problems, primarily related to the production and transportation. Production and transportation of petroleum and natural gas necessitate large refineries and terminals, as well as miles of pipelines. Construction of these facilities often causes conflict over land use. Many times, the terminals and the refineries are near coastal areas, which many people believe should be preserved as natural areas or used only for recreation. The environmental balance in these areas is delicate, and many fear disruption of this balance from the construction. There are those who are fearful of spills at these facilities. Even though large spills are not common, their environmental consequence can be devastating. Since 2011, the hydraulic fracturing technique for gathering natural gas has expanded onshore provable natural gas reserves. Fracking involves intense use of chemically treated water pumped into a well at high pressure to break loose and collect natural gas found in certain rock formations. Because this technique is cheaper than other forms of natural gas collection, widespread use of fracking has led to a massive drop in the cost of natural gas. In addition to the large amount of water being used, the water is chemically treated with toxic substances. The chemically treated water leads to high costs for proper disposal, which some fracking companies shift to the original owners of the land where the natural gas is being extracted. The risk of leaking chemically treated water, in addition to the cost shifting for maintaining the waste disposal, creates a danger of potentially hazardous chemicals contaminating surrounding areas. Another serious environmental concern raised by fracking is the potential for causing earthquakes. Some studies are beginning to suggest a correlation between earthquakes and areas with high amounts of hydraulic fracturing. The number of 3.0 magnitude earthquakes occurring in the 2 years of study amounted to a six-fold increase from the 20th century levels. While some people place the blame for the increase in seismic activity on hydraulic fracturing process, on an NPR program in 2012, a representative of the USGS said, "We find no evidence that fracking is related to the occurrence of earthquakes that people are feeling. We think that it's more intimately connected to the wastewater disposal." Even more controversies have been generated over offshore development, primarily in conjunction with federal leasing of land in the outer continental shelf for energy exploration. The federal government, primarily through the Department of Interior, exercises authority over the approximately 1.1 billion acres of continental shelf beginning 3 miles from the coastline and extending 10 to 12 miles farther offshore. As custodian of this public land, the government leases some of the private firms for exploration and production of oil. To ensure that states have some say in the development of submerged land off their shores, and to help ensure that multiple interests are taken into account when leasing decisions are made, Congress passed the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, OCSLA. As amended in 1978, OCSLA requires the Secretary of the Interior to establish a 5-year leasing program that includes as many details as possible about the plans for leases during that time. Details include the time, location, and size of leases that the Secretary believes are necessary to meet the nation's energy needs. In developing the leasing plan, the Secretary is to take into account 4 basic principles. First, the Outer Continental Shelf must be managed in a manner that reflects a balancing of economic, social, and environmental values. The impact of exploration on the marine, coastal, and human environment must be taken into account. Second, choice of locations for the development must be based on an equitable sharing of developmental benefits and environmental risks among the various regions, with special attention given to laws, goals, and policies of the affected states as communicated by their governors to the Secretary. Third, in selecting timing and location of leases, the Secretary must balance the potential for environmental damage, the potential for the discovery of oil and gas, and the potential for adverse impacts on the coastal zone. Finally, the federal government must receive fair market value for the land. The steps for developing these leasing programs are laid out by the Act. When initially drafting the program, the Secretary of the Interior must invite and consider suggestions from governors of any states that might be affected by the leasing program. The proposed program, finally drafted, must then be submitted for comments to the governors of the affected states. If any governor makes any suggestions that the Secretary denies, the reasons for the denial must be provided in writing to the governor. The next step is publication of the proposed program in the Federal Register. Any interested parties, including representatives of the affected states, have 90 days to submit written comments to the Secretary. The Secretary will then forward the proposed program, along with the comments, to Congress and the President. If any suggestions from a state were not incorporated, the Secretary must include an explanation of rejecting the state's advice. 60 days after submitting the proposed program to the President and the Congress, the Secretary may finally approve the program. Anyone who participated in the administrative process that led to the adoption of the leasing program and who will be adversely affected by it then has 60 days to challenge the program in Circuit Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia. When reviewing the actions of the Secretary, the court must take the Secretary's findings as conclusive if supported by substantial evidence on the record. After the process of judicial review has been completed, the Secretary of the Interior will then propose and conduct competitive bidding lease sales. Once land has been leased, leasees submit to the Secretary their exploration plans, followed by development and production plans. Throughout these stages, the Secretary must still operate in accordance with the four principles described previously. The future of offshore drilling, at least for the short term, was put into significant question, however, on the evening of April 20th, 2010, when the explosion rocked the deep water rig of the Deepwater Horizon, which was drilling an oil well below the surface of the Gulf of Mexico, about 50 miles south of Louisiana. The explosion killed 11 workers, injured 17 others, and became an uncontrolled gusher of oil, spilling an estimated 200 million gallons of oil into the Gulf of Mexico by the time the breach was stopped on July 15th. While the cause of the incident had not yet been determined, some of the safety features on the rig had failed, and other safety features might have reduced the damage were neither installed nor required by U.S. law, even though other countries such as Norway and Brazil require such safety features. This event, estimated to cost $21 billion for British Petroleum, the company operating the offshore drilling facility. These costs include a $7.8 billion settlement for damage done to local fisheries, tourist-based enterprises, and other adversely impacted residents of the Gulf region. In response to the spill, the administration placed a moratorium on deepwater oil and gas drilling, but that October, Obama lifted the moratorium as his administration put into place new rules that tighten standards for well design, blowout preventers, safety certification, emergency response, and worker training. A year after the spill, the Minerals Management Service, the federal agency previously responsible for policing offshore, was restructured. There was a sense that the agency needed restructuring because it had too many conflicting responsibilities relating to drilling and minerals management. Its three conflicting functions were divided into separate entities, each with an independent set of responsibilities. Oversight of safety and environmental protection in all offshore energy activities, such as oil drilling, was given to one division. Leasing of federal waters for conventional renewable energy sources will be handled by a second division. The third will collect and distribute revenues. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management will be responsible for sustainable development of the outer continental shelf, including matters relating to leasing. The Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement will be responsible for safety and environmental protection in all offshore energy activities. One of the worst problems associated with oil and petroleum, or at least the one that captures the public's attention, is oil spills resulting from the transportation of oil. The United States uses more than 19.5 million barrels of oil per day, while only producing an average of 6.7 million barrels of oil per day. With the large amount of oil produced and imported on a daily basis, the potential for an oil spill is significant. In March 1989, when the Exxon Valdez ran aground, it dumped 11.2 million gallons of oil in Alaska's Prince William Sound. While not all are as large and deemed as newsworthy as the Exxon Valdez or the Deepwater Horizon, there are many spills each year. The U.S. Coast Guard is charged with the cleanup of oil spills and has developed expertise on the issue after being involved in so many cleanups. At any oil spill, either local Coast Guard or the EPA acts as the coordinator of the cleanup, and each Coast Guard district has plans on how to perform an oil spill cleanup. Many of the techniques we use to mitigate the impact of oil spills were developed by the Coast Guard, including hazardous material detection devices, spill containment equipment, oil dispersant chemicals, and removal skimmers. The Coast Guard has also worked on preventing oil spills through the drug and alcohol testing of crews, licensing procedures, spill prevention training, improvements of cargo vessel safety, and improved oil on and off-loading methods. The Coast Guard also performs some of the investigative work on oil spills. The EPA created a program designed to prevent oil spills. The program encourages companies to prepare for, and respond to oil spills. For example, the EPA requires owners or operators of certain oil storage facilities to prepare spill prevention plans that detail the facility's spill prevention and control measures. Oil spills in conjunction with the production of oil on outer continental shelf are also a concern. The 1978 amendments of the Outer Continental Shelf Act impose strict liability for cleanup costs and damages resulting from outer continental shelf activities on owners and operators of offshore facilities and vessels carrying oil from such facilities. Liability is limited to $250,000 for a vessel and $35 million plus government removal costs for a facility. The Act also created the Offshore Oil Spill Pollution Protection Fund, which pays for all losses that cannot be covered by the responsible parties. The fund receives its income from a per-barrel tax imposed on purchasers of outer continental shelf oil. Additional liability was also imposed by the Clean Water Act. Section 311 held vessel operators strictly liable for cleanup costs incurred by the government unless the operator can prove that the cause of the spill was an act of God, an act of war, or an act of omission of a third party or negligence of the federal government. Government removal costs under this act include restoration or replacement of natural resources damaged or destroyed by the spill. Damages were limited, however, to $125,000 for inland barges, $250,000 for other vessels, and $50 million for onshore and offshore facilities. The limits would not apply if the accident were caused by willful negligence or willful misconduct within the privity and knowledge of the owner. Liability of responsible parties was broadened by the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, which replaces the foregoing liability provisions. Under this new law, each responsible party, defined as the owners and operators of the vessel, onshore facilities, or pipelines, is liable for removal costs, damage to natural resources, damages for injury to or economic losses from destruction of real or personal property, and lost profits due to the injury or destruction of any real property, personal property, or natural resources. The measure of damages to natural resources was clearly spelled out under the Act. It includes the cost of restoring, rehabilitating, rejecting, or acquiring equivalent of the damaged resources, the diminution of value of those resources pending restoration, and the reasonable cost of assessing those damages. Liability limits under the Oil Pollution Act are increased to $10 million for ships weighing more than 3,000 gross tons and $75 million for owners of offshore facilities. Limits are inapplicable if the spill is caused by gross negligence, willful misconduct, or safety violation. The Act also established a $1 billion oil spill trust fund. Nuclear energy once offered a dream of cheap, unlimited electrical power. In many people's opinion, that dream has now dimmed as numerous problems have developed during the past 40 to 50 years of attempts to harness nuclear power to satisfy energy needs. As originally conceived, uranium ore would be mined, processed, used in nuclear reactors, reprocessed, and used again in nuclear reactors, all in a continuous closed cycle. The cycle did not work that way, however, leading to perhaps the most serious problem of nuclear energy: nuclear waste. Development of nuclear energy as a fuel really began in the mid-1950s. The federal government invested a great deal of money to subsidize early research and development. To encourage industry further in developing nuclear power, Congress even passed the Price-Anderson Act of 1957 to limit liability for any nuclear reactor accident. By 1975, the high point of the nuclear energy, 56 commercial reactors had been built, 69 were under construction, and there were plans for 111 more. Then came the near catastrophe of 3 Mile Island, which alerted the public to the potential risks of nuclear accidents and also called attention to many other problems in the nuclear industry. The core meltdown at Chernobyl and the former Soviet Union further turned public opinion away from nuclear energy. As of 2012, 104 commercial reactors were generating electricity in the United States, providing 20% of the country's electricity. In contrast, other countries, such as France, rely on nuclear power for 78% of their power needs. While no new reactor has opened since 1996, more than 24 applications for new nuclear plants were pending in 2009. Federal policy may be shifting in the direction of greater reliance on nuclear power. In February of 2010, in what could be a significant boost in restarting the nuclear industry, President Obama announced more than $8 billion for new loan guarantees to build new nuclear reactors in Georgia. In March 2011, an earthquake and a tsunami struck the coast of Japan. The nuclear power plants along the coast were designed to withstand power outages related to earthquakes by each maintaining a backup generator in the basement of the nuclear facility. These backup generators would slowly cool down the nuclear fuel so that no meltdown would occur. When the tsunami struck Japan's Daiichi plant near Fukushima, the water rushed into the Daiichi nuclear facility and disabled the backup generators. The facility faced a meltdown crisis. The global fallout from the nuclear meltdown was dramatic. In 2010, Germany depended on nuclear energy for 22.7% of its total energy needs. In the aftermath of the Daiichi nuclear crisis, Germany disconnected 8 of its 17 nuclear reactors from the national grid practically overnight. Germany's leaders plan to close the remaining 9 nuclear reactors by 2022. France has made significant public moves towards enhancing the safety of its nuclear sites. Despite international pushback against use of nuclear power, in February 2012, the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission granted licenses to construct 2 new power plants in Georgia, the first new license granted in 33 years. 2 more reactors are approved for construction in March. Nuclear power plants still face public disapproval high closing costs, and expensive safety concerns, yet nuclear power also does not contribute to global climate change. Given the competing environmental and political concerns and the lack of clear steps forward, the future of nuclear power in the United States is still uncertain. A major problem with the nuclear industry is safety. The U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission is the arm of the federal government responsible for regulating commercial nuclear power plants, the nuclear materials in those plants, and the transportation and storage of nuclear waste. Before a nuclear power plant can be constructed, it must first obtain a license which certifies that all federal requirements have been met. Though nuclear safety has been less than flawless in terms of accidents, and nuclear industry has good safety record. Although not environmentally related per se, the nuclear industry has been beset with economic problems. Costs were underestimated, and many of the facilities completed during the 80s and early 90s were 500 to 1,000% over budget. And the licensing procedures caused costly delays in startups, with many plants taking 4 to 8 years to obtain all the necessary permits. The most troublesome problem with nuclear energy perhaps is nuclear waste. 4 types of waste are created, all of which present problems. First are the high-level radioactive liquids created during the reprocessing of reactor fuels. More than 100 million gallons of these highly dangerous wastes currently are being stored in temporary containment facilities in New York, North Carolina, Idaho, and Washington. Stored along with the high-level waste are transuranic wastes. These are byproducts of reactor fuel and military waste processing. Some have a half-life of over 200,000 years. The most well-known of these dangerous byproducts is probably plutonium-239, with a half-life of 24,000 years. A third category is spent nuclear fuel, which is currently being stored in cooling ponds at reactor sites. Many of these ponds are nearly full. This category of waste was never expected to be so large because this spent fuel was supposed to have been recyclable. Unfortunately, the necessary technology for recycling it did not develop. Finally, there are low-level radioactive wastes. This category includes such items as clothing, tools, and equipment that have become radioactive during exposure to reactors. These wastes are currently being stored in repositories in South Carolina, Washington, and a limited number in Utah. As the nuclear industry was developing, most of the industry assumed they would discover the technology to reprocess and then safely contain the waste. When the technology did not develop, the industry was and still is unprepared to handle all the hazardous waste. A major problem is finding permanent sites to dispose of waste. Not only is waste disposal a problem, but the cost of decommissioning plants now appears to be much higher than anticipated. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission requires abilities to put aside up to $130 million for each of the nuclear plants to cover the cost of dismantling them. Not only is this amount apparently going to be far less than needed, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission estimates that the total amount that utilities have set aside falls far short of even this inadequate sum. To make matters still worse, some plants are wearing out far earlier than their projected 40-year lifespan after having never consistently produced the low-cost energy they were designed to produce. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission will allow plants to sit idle for up to 60 years before the owners must dismantle them. However, maintaining, inspecting, and securing a closed nuclear facility can cost up to $10 million a year. A new method for disposing of nuclear facility is simply to sell the entire power plant, often to a foreign buyer. 30 countries in the world have at least one power plant. The Atomic Energy Act of 1954 is the primary legislation that gives the federal government the authority to protect human health and the environment from excessive exposure to radiation. The agency responsible for regulating the nuclear industry is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The NRC issues licenses for construction and operation of nuclear facilities, as well as for the possession, use, and handling of and disposal of nuclear waste. The NRC has generally been staffed by people who believe in nuclear energy and is cited by some as an example of a captured agency. Aside from the regulation of nuclear plants themselves, many regulations oversee the proper disposal of nuclear waste. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982 was passed to resolve the problem of sitting and developing permanent repositories for high-level nuclear waste. By 1985, the Department of Energy was to nominate 5 sites. After extensive public hearings, the president was to make a recommendation to Congress if the site were approved by the selected state or Congress. The DOE was to apply to the NRC for a repository license. Until the permanent facility was established, an interim storage program was to be maintained. Nomination of 3 sites, Volcanic Rock, Nye County, Nevada, salt beds of Def City, Smith County, Texas, and basalt deposits in Hanford Reservation in Washington led to an uproar among local citizens. In 1987, Congress, perhaps the frustration over the political opposition created by the site selection process, passed legislation directing the DOE to examine a site in Yucca Mountain, Nevada. The proposal to make Yucca Mountain a nuclear waste repository is an enduring controversial issue. Many scientists argue that Yucca Mountain has the following features that make it suitable for nuclear waste repository. First, it is in a remote location and far from the large population center. Second, the dry climate, less than 6 inches of rainfall each year, is a favorable condition. Finally, Yucca Mountain has an extremely deep water table, 800 to 1,000 feet below the level of the potential repository. However, environmental and consumer organizations want Yucca Mountain to be disqualified from consideration as a nuclear repository. Despite strong objections from the state of Nevada and some environmental groups, Congress approved the site in 2002, allowing the DOE to move forward in acquiring the necessary permits and licenses from the NRC. There have been multiple delays in Yucca Mountain project, and in 2009, the Obama administration eliminated funding for Yucca Mountain, and the Secretary of the Department of Energy informed Congress that Yucca Mountain would no longer be an option for storing nuclear waste. However, no new site has been proposed for permanent nuclear waste storage. President Obama appointed a commission to find a safe solution for dealing with nuclear waste, and the Energy Secretary Chu told a congressional committee in 2010 that for the foreseeable future, nuclear plants will likely store the spent rods on site.